exam is going to come up. The syllabus is going to, this second section is really dealing with three populations. One we just got finished with, these populists who are saying there's something wrong with this economic system. It is taking away my inherent freedoms as an American citizen. And populism emerges, and you see this rural population in particular, Texans in particular, and they run a candidate, William Jennings Bryan, and he gets clocked, right? And for the most part, from this point on, the United States does not look back. The second population that kind of follows them is this group called the progressives, and we'll talk about that term in just a second, right? Because again, like everything has been politicized, so people get mad, right? Progressives are going to say, in essence, here's the modern world. We live in a world of bus schedules and mask requirements and minimum wage, and we live in a world that is complicated. It's not simple. You can't go live in throw the tea in, you can't go live in the woods and get away from the world, right? I know it's frustrating. I know it's hard. I gotta wear a watch now. I gotta show up at Blunkey's class at a specific time. But they accept it, and they make a compromise with the American society that says, if I play by the rules, if I'm doing these things, I also have an opportunity to be rewarded. I also have an ability to move up the economic ladder. There's social economic mobility, right? Progressivism. The last part, which we're going to clean up next week, is going to be when this goes into the shitter, basically, the Great Depression. What happens when the American economy, based on this, all of a sudden down it goes? How do we respond? So there's a real connection to those three topics. Those are the three that are going to be on the exam, right? So again, you don't have to think more broadly, but those are the questions that we're looking at. And if you look at these generic questions of, why is there minimum wage? Why is there safety product warnings? Why do you have, all of these ability, children that can't work anymore, prohibition against vices? It's because of this period of time that we're about to talk about the progressive era, right? I was like this image again from Library of Congress. Why? Because it's got this automobile parade, turn of the century. Again, I wrote not the last book, but before that was on automobiles and automobile safety. By the way, what you're going to see coming by here, these first two are probably internal combustion. You can't really tell, but the ones that are real flimsy, right? They're real high-wheeled and flimsy, are in all likelihood electric cars. So electric cars were around at the turn of the century, where that one definitely is an electric car, big ass battery, etc. The real meaty ones that are like on wagons that look at are steam powered. Steam is not efficient, so the reason why internal combustion is efficient is because it's internal. Steam is external, and so it's just not as efficient. The batteries didn't work so well then and today. But you're living in a world, and I was like this at a certain point in time, you're going to see this horse. It's going to clip off, and this horse is sitting there going, what the hell? Not that guy, because he seems all right. But, it is, there you are, right? So you got a handsome cab. He's like, who the hell? What we were talking about in the 19th century is the equivalent of this horse's reaction. This is not the world I live in. Right? Now I've got my kids who are just looking at their phones all the time, and yada yada. The old man yells across. Welcome to the progressive era. Welcome to how things are going to change. Right? And that terminology, and we'll get to it in just a second, the terminology of progressivism. Why do historians look and say there is a new era? There is something that changes. One of the arguments I would make, and I did make last time, was that 1896 election is going to solidify in the two-party system an argument in regards to industrial capitalism. And while the Democrats and the populists are saying, whoa, whoa, time out, slow down, we're not going to do this, the Republicans are going to say, no, we ain't the party of Lincoln anymore. We're not about emancipation and all that kind of stuff. We're about industrial capitalism. And notice those places that are going to be heavily in support of that, the same areas that are making money as a result of that. Right? There is no, email or whatever that says you're now in the progressive era. There's a feel, there's a vibe. People don't wake up and go, I'm going to get rid of industrial capitalism. I want to turn my back on it. Right? A new generation. Again, I mentioned that talk about the same time. There's a new generation of African Americans waking up going, I ain't a slave and I never was a slave, I'm an American citizen. Right? I don't have to act as if I'm somehow second class citizen. Sanely, more broadly, you're seeing in the United States a generational shift that says, I don't care if there are corporations, I don't care if I have to go work for somebody to get my head start. This is the world in which I live in. And I'm not gonna go try and look backwards and see the world, the things I've lost. Right? this is kind of negative. Again, we're in the midst of that saying, we're gonna go back to the way the world was. Good luck with that, right? Because history don't work that way. It goes in one direction. Time goes in one direction, right? You can't turn the clock back. Progressivism, those two terms, progress and modernity, are two of the slipperiest concepts you're ever going to see. And again, I studied this period of time. I'm really interested in this period of time, particularly the Gilded Age, the earlier part of it. But regardless, is that what is progress? What is modern? All right, this cruel bastard, I used to ask that question to students on exam. It was terrible because nobody could read, what is modern? Modern is new and improved. Modern's better. You know, this phone is better than that phone. Why? Doesn't it make a phone call? Right? Doesn't it take a picture? You can get a flip phone and still play your games on it and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's better, right? Progress has that same kind of conception. Something has improved. And you'll see here this notion of assuming that newer is better. Science is going to drive us forward. The economy is going to drive us forward. We're going to think more clearly and more progressively. Is that always the case? Not always the case, right? Better world, right? We're living in the consequences of an industrial revolution that's having environmental consequences, right? By the end of World War II, we're going to be so smart, our wars are going to be fought with atomic devices. That may not be a better world. That may not be something that you look and go, oh, well, hey, you know, sign me up, right? I always use the example of, let's say, you have 500 acres of old growth forest, right? Now, we're talking stuff that has not been touched by mankind in terms of what do you do with those 500 acres? Well, I'm going to save it. I'm going to set it aside. I'm going to make sure that it's like that for generations in perpetuity. Is that progressive? Sure. Yeah, okay, it's, you know, I see that as something that's good. But what if I turn around and go, you know what I'm going to do with my 500 acres? I'm going to log it. I'm going to put people to work. I'm going to put money in their pockets. They're going to be able to go to school. They're going to be able to pay for their college education. They're going to be able to go on vacation, get a truck. I don't give a shit. You know, it's their money. Is that progressive? Yes. And we get to this, again, it started about 10 years ago. It was like 2010 or something like that. So I guess it's 12 years ago. Where, on the right, people use that term progressivism as if it meant some sort of socialist takeover. Right? I had a student one time, very smart, she graduated. I posted the letter on it. And she literally, her hands were shaking. She came in, she was a really smart kid, and she came in, I knew her well from the class, and she was like, I'm very worried about this concept. Why are you talking about progressivism? Isn't it a bad thing? I said, what are you talking about, progressivism? She says, well, I've heard it's a bad thing, right? And I find out that she's got a coach who apparently, as we find out soon enough, is a big fan of Glenn Beck. And in the 2010s, Glenn Beck made money by getting people pissed off about progressivism. It's picked, you know, other things elsewhere. And she brings in an 8.5 by 10.5, 4 sheets of paper. I say 10.5 because the guy, and it was a guy who gave it to her, the coach who gave it to her, had cut off the top, the top ½ inch. Why? Because it had the URL that was on the printout, right? So again, when you plagiarize from online sources, it's real easy to see. So I go and I just Google where this stuff comes from. It comes from the Glenn Beck website, right? So suddenly a word is scary to Americans. Oh no, it's a word, right? Progress is one of these concepts that is going to be picked up from everyone. And if you see the note, I've got it on Blackboard. I referenced this book, nice, usually I'm bringing these big old fat tomes, nice little progressivism book. And it's basically, you know, who are the progressives? First question they ask. Progressives made the first comprehensive to grapple with the ills of a modern industrial urban society. Hence their record of achievement and failures has considerable relevance. And I'll spare you the detail. It goes, historians will focus on certain groups. But who are progressives? Everyone. Farmers are progressive, conservatives are progressive, Republicans are progressive, then and today. Right? I know the left has picked up this term of being the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. It's bullshit. It doesn't have any historical relevance. You can use whatever term you want. But please, as thinking adults, try to shut down or tone down this is what I'm told is bad. This is what I'm told I should be afraid of. That's what you're in college to do, is to challenge that stuff, right? So I'll see it eventually in the kind of dialogue as we get to the 20th century. My suggestion to you as intellectuals, as intelligent people, is to not politicize everything through your emotions, to turn everything into, I hate that, why? Because I was told to hate that, right? It was already starting last night in the Super Bowl. You already heard oh, I hate this. Who cares? A football game, right? You know, so again, there's this kind of virulent poison that has existed in the United States in the last 10 years, which is cultural. It's what do you like? What kind of clothes do you wear? What kind of music you listen to? It is meaningless, right? Unless you really want to really dial into it, and then, boy, you know, tune into the TV show, because we'll get you pissed off today and plenty to get pissed off tomorrow. Progressivism is dealing with historical change. Right? I would not define myself as a progressive because I think the word is idiotic, right? But you look at it and say, here it is in terms of both Democrats and Republicans are going to embrace this. They're not looking to go back and live in populist times. They just aren't, right? One of the key questions is who gets to decide, right? COVID pops up. Suddenly you've got the CDC saying, well, we should wear masks, and you should get inoculated, and you should use hand sanitizer, and all that 6-foot difference. Those who believe that medical professionals have the authenticity, have the standing to make that call, are clearly different from those who are saying, no, use horse dewormer, use ivermectin, use this, use that, shine light up people's whatever. That it's a question, what you see today in politics is who do you trust? Who is it that has authority? And progressivism is going to step in and say categorically in this historical period of time, college educated, professionals, people who test things, people who rely on data. Today we would call it STEM, right? STEM subjects are going to increasingly be seen as being legitimate people to look at. Albert Einstein, Edison, et cetera, et cetera. Right, so introducing progressivism, first thing I would say is get rid of the idiotic third grade, wow, this is what I heard on the radio, right? Whatever. Okay, yeah, do that if you want to go talk to third grade. Secondly is to recognize it's taking place in every format of American society, right? Everywhere, and they're going to have different perspectives on that. So what is it, and who is claiming, right, that they should be listened to? Should it be engineers? Should it be 4 out of 5 doctors? Should it be professors? Should it be average Americans? Should it be religious institutions, which are going to have a big voice? And what do they try and do in terms of the reality of modern America? Right? A lot of you were correct. People are living in cities now, and they're working for wages, and you got to show up on time because you got to have, you're to the clock. You're much more dependent. Right? This is the world we live in now. It looks very much like 2022. And their argument is, how do we ensure that we as Americans have our rights and are able to prosper in some fashion? Right? Some examples of this new world. Best example, I always love these, former bike makers, hoot off for the bicyclists. Orville and Wilbur are going to be designing this. Now there's a national really international competition on who can design powered, controlled, and sustained flight. I always say 2 out of 3 is not okay on this one. I could jump off the top of a building and I should have, controlled and sustained flight, but probably not, wouldn't end well. They are going to demonstrate, which in all of human history had been a truism, that's about as likely as man can fly. Well, now they do, right? Now we're using technology to do things like get into an automobile, or in the 1890s, a bicycle, or in 1903, beginning aeronautics, submarines, the use of technology. When you look at the technology, and again, I love my Gilded Age in large part because it's that steampunk vibe. You go through this list and everything in this room that we're sitting in right now, even your computers, is either on the designing board or designed by this point in time. The one thing they haven't figured out yet, because they haven't really conceptualized it, is telephony is using satellites, right? So they don't get the whole satellite communication, but everything else is wireless, yada yada, automobiles, you can read, steel skyscrapers, motion pictures. It looks very much like the world we live in today, right? And suddenly there's opportunities for people who are engineering, again, looking to engineer. You're going to see a lot of your majors kind of pop up. So all the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, I guess is left. Psychology. Right? So this is Sigmund Freud, young Sigmund Freud, old Sigmund Freud. If you're a psych major, you probably have heard, if you're not, you probably heard as well. Freud was, I would say, he's not an effective clinician, right? So he wasn't a good scientist. He fudged on a lot of his stuff. But he is a pretty effective philosophical approach to psychology. And so this idea of the unconscious, what Freud popularizes, And these are in headline news in Corpus Christi, Texas. He and his student Carl Jung are gonna go across the United States. But you can look at 1905, 1906 in Corpus Christi newspapers. They're talking about Carl Jung, they're talking about Sigmund Freud. That the supposed perception of people that we show each other is really just the tip of an iceberg. Who we are is much more subconscious, much more product of the kind of medical aspects of who we are, how we were raised, where we were raised, you know, whether we like certain smells or looks or whatever. Right? Freud is going to, in essence, argue that even the perception of people that they're being rational may have an element of irrationality connected to it. Right? Not only are you flying and going on elevators up to the 50th floor, but now the question is there really such a thing as the rational brain? Or maybe you can have a television show that does nothing that plays to the irrational brain, right? You know, oh yeah, I'm pissed off, I don't know why, right? Because it's hardwired into the human condition. The big kahuna is this guy, right? Albert Einstein. I always love, you know, he's a humanist. He's somebody who recognizes he lives in human society. He's teaching here at Lincoln University, an African American university. Taught at Princeton. But what Einstein does in the first decade of the 20th century is to use physics, numbers, right? And I'll say this repeatedly throughout this semester. You may not believe in science, but science believes in you, right? Is that you may look and go, oh, I don't believe any of that bullshit. You don't have to, right? If you believe 1 + 1 = 2, and you know, again, who knows where we are now, right? You know, burn the book, and then we don't have to know it. But if you believe in mathematics, then what Einstein basically shows is that the physical reality that we live in is relativistic. Our place in time is different because of the gravity well that we live in, where we live in, the forces that are affecting us. And there's a real practical application. Every one of you has a cell phone. Every one of you has your cell phone connecting to a device that's out of Earth's gravity. And that device, every microsecond, has to correct for the fact that its experience of time is different than ours. Right? You go to the top of a mountain, time has changed for you if you're down at sea level, where we are in Corpus Christi. That's true. I don't believe it. You don't have to. You just, you know, I refuse to believe it. You don't have to. Right? And in essence, what they're saying is that all of these truisms, all of these things that supposedly never will change, man can't fly, we can never build a building over 40 feet, right, et cetera, are all up in the air now. And you open up this possibility of a world that can be substantially changed. Not just, well, it's just the way things are. Right? What happens when a woman is suddenly a scientist, or African American is suddenly, or a rural person is suddenly important when it comes to the arts or something like that? Those are the differences that are going to be challenged here. The last one that I always point out, and it's a mind blower because, you know, it is to recognize deep space and deep time. We have a satellite up right now, the James Webb satellite, just starting to pull back information. The reason it's there is to see deep space, and I won't mess with your brains on deep space, but deep time is the same way. Is that 13 billion years is a time frame that we can't understand, we can't grasp with, but we can demonstrate it, we can prove it, right? You don't have to have creation in 7 days, maybe it's 7 billion days, right? Those kinds of interpretations that science are going to show. First life on Earth, which is largely this stuff, right? You know, algal mats and what have you. I always laugh because the dinosaurs, you know, you call something a dinosaur and it's like, oh, it's old, a piece of crap or something like that. Dinosaurs are around for 60 million years, right? Humans, we're not even a rounding error there. What we would call humans today is about 50,000 years ago. There were two, so if you are a racist, here's the 2 different races of human beings. Thankfully, we wiped them out. And even though everyone in this room probably has a little bit of genetics from Neanderthals, you know, it exists. You know, great-grandpa was doing some whoopee with the shorter guys. But again, the recency of this kind of changes this notion of saying everything is always the same. Nothing will change. Nothing shows, historical record shows just the reverse. What is new here? What's different? Why am I not talking about William Jennings Bryan anymore and the populace? Because in essence, these new perspectives, this new way of looking at the world is now going to be informed by different authorities. We're going to look and say, you know, those people who know engineering, there's a reason Henry Ford was successful, because he knew how to, you know, he called himself a grease monkey. He knew how to mess around with pipes and hoses and internal combustion engines. The reason why engineering works, the reason why critical thinking works, right? They're all tied to, and here's the critical point, they're all tied to ethical views. What's right, what's wrong? What am I gonna do with my 500 acres of oak grove forest, right? What am I gonna do with, historically, and again, constitutionally, as Americans, none of my damn business what you do. You have the freedom as long as you don't take somebody else's freedom away to do whatever the hell you want to do. What progressivism does, and again, here's where you start to make assumptions, well, this is better, this is worse. This is right, this is wrong. A Gilded Age person is gonna go, oh, a little child, look, he's gonna work perfectly in my factory. But somebody from the progressive era on is gonna go, you're a monster, this is a child. They still have a whole life ahead of them. You're gonna put them in the middle of a steel factory? That's absurd, those are ethical decisions, right? It's like slavery. You look at today, I think you gotta be kidding me, own another human being? 200 years ago, oh yes, well, you know, I'll own that and I'll own donkeys and what have you. Who gets to set the agenda? Becomes the central question. Who has the authority? You're gonna see three different kind of arguments being made by today's Republicans and Democrats and independents, right? What emerges to it. This optimism is going to be driving it in the modern era. And if there's one truism you can say about American politics over the since the progressive era, is that presidential candidates who have established a sense of optimism, this is how we're going, until recently, an optimistic ascension has always been kind of a reflection of America's general perception of itself. We're optimistic people, right? It's true when we start talking about the rest of the world. The rest of the world kind of likes Americans individually, maybe not our policies, but they like us primarily because we tend to be optimistic people. And optimism is not, I'm gonna sleep through Blanky's quest again, I'm gonna go win the Powerball, right? I'm gonna trade Bitcoin or whatever the hell the QR code that was floating around there, right? That's not optimism, that's well, let's put it all on red or black, right? That's gambling, right? Optimism is that I recognize, may have done poorly on this Blanky exam, but I recognize the ability to correct those mistakes and do very well in the next one. That's optimism. Trusting yourself, trusting your own abilities. That's what's gonna be driving this. So if you'll notice, it's a very different perspective than what we had in response to industrial capitalism. When industrial capitalism shows up in that first generation or two, people are on their back heels. My God, all of a sudden I lost my Cooper business in Corpus Christi. What am I gonna do with all these railroads? This generation, and every generation subsequent, is going to say, up until the Great Depression, going to say, I can win by this. I can do what I need to do. And again, it may mean for one person I can amass millions of dollars. It may mean another one, I can go fishing every Tuesday morning, right? People have different goals. They're not all the same, right? But this progressive era, that's what progressivism is. It's not Glenn Beck's. Oh my God, they're progressive. I don't know what we'll talk about that. Okay, what do the progressives do? They're first ones to sort of, and I mean not physically, but kind of conceptualize the idea that poverty is an absolute killer in terms of optimism and opportunity. If you're somebody living in these conditions, you're not saving money, you're not looking to the future, you're trying to put food on the table that night. And the argument is the environmental, again, this isn't trees and bunnies and all that kind of stuff, or ice sheets. This is the environment in which you live. That it has a direct effect on how successful you can be. What was the assumption before? No, social Darwinism. You're either born with it or you don't have it. God has not touched you, right? And surprising, maybe not surprisingly, is that most women, immigrants, people of color, et cetera, no, you don't have what it takes. Increasingly, progressives are gonna look and say, if everybody is starting at the same starting point, then that's one thing. But if you're starting here, and you're worried more about your ability to get food or your ability to keep your kid alive more than a year, which is pretty rare in these circumstances, then your priorities are going to be very different. Right? These same progressives are going to look and see the political corruption that we talked about in Gilded Age politics, the two-party system, and in particular the spoils system. How dare they give away brisket and beer in exchange to vote? Right? Well, we'll give you instead our tax breaks and yada yada. So they're just going to change the gimmicks. Again, it is a longer discussion in terms of the subtlety of this, but for the most part, they're going to look and say government needs to be efficient. You need to have people who know what the hell they're talking about. You don't put your brother-in-law in charge of the post office because he's somebody who's going to follow what you say. You put somebody in charge of the post office who's good at leading the post office, or the engineering department or something like that. The competency is now the key component of who should be in charge and who shouldn't be in charge. Again, how do you define competency? The last one is that they're also going to recognize that this is U.S. Steel in 1901. Andrew Carnegie is at the head of the WPS, first billionaire on the planet. That when you're talking companies of this size, they are too big to fail. You cannot kind of conceptualize them, but they themselves have a power that is extra constitutional. What happens with that? Is there any relationship to that? And when we start talking about, you guys were right on when you were talking about trusts and destroying competition. Right? And for some of you in the margins, I said, well, isn't that what capitalism is all about? Isn't capitalism supposed to be competition? Right? It is. It's supposed to have the better idea is supposed to win. The more efficient production should win. In actuality, what you see is bigger wins. And the federal government's going to look and say, just because you're big does not mean you get to win. And it's going to begin to have antitrust legislation. Again, not hampering business, opening up competition. There's two different concepts there. And an example of this, it's not the reason why the progressive era exists. An example of this is that by the 1890s, 1900s, young women in particular are increasingly in the workforce. They are either in one of two ways when they are young, in a sweatshop, and you can see here, it's usually 10-hour workdays, 12-hour workdays. If you fall behind this man back here, your boss may have a couple of suggestions for you back in the back room. Right? Here, honey, here, I know we can make it up. Right? A lot of sexual predation going on. Young sisters, daughters, children, etc., wives, young. If you are married and have children, the assumption is you leave that job and you work at home. So homework, very much as you can see, they're making paper flowers here. You have the children, again, this notion of saying, shouldn't kids be out getting in trouble, right? You know, going breaking stuff and whatever. I don't know. Shouldn't they be out being kids? No, they're here as workers. By the 1900s, what you're starting to see, and again, I just walked over it, but what you saw there was a series of ways in which women are increasingly part of the workforce, right? This is true. I was the cop there. That was sort of a staged, but Alice Wells is now a constable, now a police officer, right? She's standing there with the revolver out, put the cap in your hands, quit double parking, right? Bam, bam, down you go. International Ladies Garment Workers, that's what ILGWU stands for. Helen Gurley Brown, a woman who is in charge of that unskilled, semi-skilled industrial union. Sounds pretty familiar to the Gilded Age, right? Working conditions and hours and all the rest of that stuff. And what they're going to do is, in essence, look at themselves and present themselves to the American public, not as workers, as we saw in Gilded Age, but as women. Do you want your mom to be in these conditions? Do you want your daughter to be in these conditions? Is it right? Is it good? Notice how some people might say, yeah, hell, whatever, put a kid in there, they're cheaper. Other people might say, no, this is wrong, I don't want this. The Supreme Court, and by the way, SCOTUS is not some weird affliction. Supreme Court of the United States, I don't see POTUS and FLOTUS. Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court is going to hear an argument for one of these workers. First of all, they never identify the woman's name. She's only known as Mrs. Elmer Gotcher. She's only known as the wife of a man who has got standing in society. But they rule in her case because she is a woman. Ladies, you might like this. Because you're weaker. You're emotionally frail. You can't do things that are difficult, right? Annoying, progressive, right? These 9 guys are going to say, well, women are weaker. We all know this. Come on, look at them. They don't have to wear these weird corsets and stuff like that. This changing view. So when the ILGWU goes out on strike in Lawrence, you see the same Gilded Age response. They call in the state militia. A 15-year-old boy who has happened to be on the picket line is bayoneted to death. Right? Getting stabbed once is one thing. Being stabbed multiple times so that you're killed by that, and you're 15 is another. Right? This is straight out of Gilded Age Handbook. Again, I mentioned when I was talking about the strikes that the devil literally resides in the details. I could have spent a lot of time talking about these strikes and the way in which they were busted up, mostly by people in uniform, the state, coming in and saying, we don't like you, we're going to shut down your protest. Right? What happened in the past? Nothing. Now, the radicals, those farmers, those this, those that. Here in the progressive era, why do I use this example? The ILGWU sends their children out of Lawrence. They put their children on trains to the safest place they knew, New York City. Right? It's like, what? Go see a show, see the Mets, they're in town or whatever. Now, New York City, largely where most of them made landfall in this country, right? So it's familiar, there's probably paths here. And they don't appeal to the state, they don't appeal to the federal government, they sure as hell aren't going to appeal to the business owners. They go straight to the heart of the American public. And they say, is this how you want women to be treated, right? A little child shall lead them. Who else used that phrase? Get back to this. Sunday school. Get your Sunday school teacher in here and you'll be in trouble. Guy from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, right? A child shall lead them. They asked for bread, they received banners. We came from Lawrence to find a home, right? On Fifth Avenue of all places. They're making an argument, they're going to win their strike because they're going to appeal to this progressive sensibility. Not dollars and cents, but emotions and perspectives, and saying in essence, this is something that needs to change. At this same time, you see the same process emerging in the city of New York. The shirtwaist is simply a blouse, we would call it a blouse today, but it also reflects articles of clothing or really interesting historical subjects. Women didn't wear those clothes most of the time. They had corsets, they had stuff that buttoned down to the knees, right? Imagine going out on a subway or going to work in something like that. The clothing that women wore was detrimental to public engagement. You're not going to go see a game or go to a bar or something like that. You're wearing a corset. One of the most popular items for a new generation of women was to not have the corset, not have your whole body constricted like that, but to have something called a blouse. Ooh, I never heard of it, right? It was also 1913, the first time there was something called a brassiere, right? So undergarments are used. These are very popular. There are cheap production, labor kind of tactics taking place. Here's one of them. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Again, the dude sitting there watching these unskilled women do their work. Many of them kind of had children or family obligations. They're there for 12 hours. A kid requires more than just simply, hey, I'll see you in half a day. They would sometimes skip out to breastfeed their children. So the owner simply did what? Oh, well, you're skipping out? We're going to put bolts on the doors. We're going to lock you in. And while they are appealing to the New York State, New York City, the unions, etc., a fire breaks out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company that kills 146 women. Most of them on fire, jumping to their deaths because they don't want to roast alive inside. It is horrific, and it's on display. And the question is do you want your daughter in this? Right? So progressivism is going to change the way, at the exact same time, this is 1912, at the exact same time there is a mine disaster in Mississippi. No one pays it any mind. Oh, it's just miners, right? But here you have women. Here you have a new perspective, right? That's what's different. That's how America has changed. We didn't see this during the Gilded Age. We didn't see this early on. We saw social Darwinism. We said, God has put you in that place, right? Progressives are saying, you know what? If I was given just a little access, right? Some of you out there have really bad internet connections. If I had internet connection, I could probably do a little bit better in keeping up with quizzes and all that kind of stuff in my courses in TMCC. And it would be a reasonable argument to make. All right, questions? I know I'm kind of going through this material. All right, same story, different lessons. Why is there, the question is, why is there a new approach? Question becomes this ethical question. Notice I'm not using morality. Morality is tied to a religious sensibility. Ethics are not free of that. We're going to come back to and see a very strong presence, particularly by Christianity, because America is dominated by Christianity. So there will be a moral component to this. There also is an increasing threat at this point in time if nothing is done. So there is no turning back the clock. There is no, make America, there is no, we're going to go back to the 1770s. It ain't going to happen. And the last election kind of proved that. Eugene Debs, who used to be a producerist, who was a union leader, big fan of William Jennings Bryan, 1903 is going to be part of forming the Socialist Party of America. Remember in the Gilded Age, I kept saying there is no socialism, man. There's producerism. Welcome to socialism. Now you have a different ideology which says not only are we going to fight individual ownership, but we're going to change the nature of the government itself. Right? One thing history is abundantly clear of: you do nothing to address the problem, right? You keep having, George Floyd incidents, there will be a violent reaction at the end. That is 100% true. Every historian will, if you don't reform, it's just going to build up, and it's going to blow. And the Socialist Party here is basically saying, we've tried to reform. We've tried to work within the parties. We're going to try a different system that shuts down industrial capitalism. Same thing with the unions. Every time a union forms, they're trying to protect skills. The Wobblies, the IWW, is no longer connected to American producerism and the Republican Party and all that kind of stuff that I was talking about before. Good day's wages, and I feed you all. They're looking and saying, we as workers control the means of production, and we are going to control it globally. So this has nothing to do with the US of A. This has everything to do with a very different kind of political mindset. Right? Welcome to the modern era. Those years of quantum saying, hey, there's no socialism, are over now. Right? So you do nothing, you don't change it, you keep burning up people in Triangle Shirtwaist fires, these institutions will continue to thrive. You do something and show that there is at least someone listening, you feel seen, all of a sudden you see a different process. All right. It is a response to conditions. In that sense, it's reactive. So it's looking and saying, here's the reality in which we find ourselves. They have two major traits that are going to be key to the argument and the longevity of their argument. The first one, as I said, optimism. American optimism. Whether you are steeped in it or not, Americans in general, our culture is optimistic. Tomorrow is another day, right? You know, Gone with the Wind. And we are much more optimistic when you look at kind of polling, even in bad times, compared to people around the globe. Now, we're not exclusively, we're not, you know, these happy-go-lucky people, right? But there is a sense of, I can do that. And there is a much less of a sense of there's envy, but there isn't a hatred against wealth accumulation. There isn't a sense the state should do something against wealth accumulation. We're unique in that regard. Right? And it's tied to that sense of, I may be there myself soon someday, so don't mess with it. The other is that, as you're gonna see, it is driven by college education. It is driven by this assumption that critical thinking is different than, well, this is what I feel. I don't give a shit what you feel. I didn't like the halftime thing. I don't care. I did, right? You're American, deal with it. Well, I'm gonna yell on Facebook. Well, go ahead, right? It's this sense of saying, college education basically says, here's the new way in which society is going to operate. It's going to operate by facts, it's going to operate by critical thinking. And by screaming and yelling about it, kind of saying, well, I'll just do this. That's fine, but recognize that you're historically, it's ahistorical, right? And progressives are going to make this argument in a strong way. Three broad types. Here's where you're going to see Republicans and Democrats, independents, whatever. Want more information? Here's a nice little thin volume that kind of steps right through. Social gospel, national progressive, corporate liberals. Right? So there's one thing you want to prepare yourself for on the exam question. What's the distinction between those? That's what I'm going to be doing. I'm sure I know what time it is. That's what I'm going to be doing. I think it's pretty much, yeah, 10:40. That's going to be doing the rest of the week, at least on Wednesday.